Most of us are familiar with the Chernobyl disaster and the effects that it's had on the plant's surrounding environment. But in the years that have passed since, a lot of information that was previously withheld from the public has come to light, shedding even more light on the disaster and its aftermath. One of the most important safety systems that should be considered when a nuclear power plant is being designed is the inclusion of a containment chamber in case an accident occurs, as it did at Chernobyl on the 26th of April, 1986. While most nuclear plants are managed properly with all the necessary safety systems in place, there's always a small chance that something may go wrong, and the resulting leaking radiation must be contained as effectively as possible. Thus, these plants virtually have always had a containment chamber installed. It's usually made of steel, lead, or concrete and houses the core reactor along with all the dangerous elements that contain radioactive material. The structure needs to be airtight to work properly, and in most cases, it's of a cylindrical shape with a dome covering the top. To ensure that the structure is also watertight, the inside walls are usually layered with steel panels, which also help with stability during earthquakes and other natural disasters such as tornadoes. But the containment chamber is actually the last line of defense against leaking radiation. In the event of an accident, several fission product barriers are usually in place, including the fuel cladding, reactor vessel, and shielding. If all of these systems fail to contain the radiation, the containment chamber comes into play, and hence it needs to be installed correctly with the correct materials used during its construction. It also needs to be able to withstand enormous pressure buildups and debris that may be dislodged during an explosion. Before it's installed, it's tested to ensure that if radiation needs to be contained, it'll only release a very small fraction of the amount being released by the core over the period of a few days. In most countries around the world, any nuclear power plant is obligated to have a containment chamber installed, with low-powered research reactors being the exception to that rule, since an accident at one of these facilities will not necessarily result in extensive radiation leaks. Containment chambers were first conceived of and built in the US in the 1950s, and before long most countries around the world adopted this approach in their nuclear programs. But this was not the case in the Soviet Union. In the Soviet bloc, it was seen as unnecessary, and when facilities in that area did install these chambers, they were rarely up to the needed standard. And if an accident was to occur at one of these plants, it would have done little to shield the outside world from the leaking toxic materials. Unfortunately, when the Chernobyl plant was being constructed, it was decided that a containment chamber was not needed. Instead, it was later discovered that Unit 4, where the disaster occurred, contained an internal structure that could only withstand the loss of one pressure tube. By the correct standards, this structure is by no means meant to contain radiation, but it's rather seen as a confinement tool. Chernobyl's reactor number 4, which is an RBMK reactor, was considered to be the backbone of the Soviet nuclear program. The authorities felt that it was reliable and cost-effective and that there was no need for a containment chamber, since they believed it to be completely safe. This was, of course, proven to be a misconception when the true gravity of the Chernobyl disaster came to light. It wasn't until 24 days after the explosion at Chernobyl that efforts were made to construct and install a containment chamber. But sadly, this came far too late for the first responders who arrived at the site that night. Unfortunately, they had no way of knowing just how dangerous the area had become following the meltdown of the reactor, and with the best of intentions, did their utmost to contain the resulting fires, but in doing so, were exposed to massive amounts of radiation. One would imagine that when a firefighter or paramedic is dispatched to the scene of a nuclear meltdown, they'd be given as much information and protection as possible so that they can do their jobs properly. But this was never done at Chernobyl. Firefighters raced to the scene dressed in nothing more than their uniforms, helmets, and leather boots, none of which afforded them any protection against the toxic environment. When news of the disaster broke, 37 fire crews raced to the scene to help. 186 firemen arrived in 81 fire engines, none of whom were properly equipped to deal with a nuclear meltdown. And as a result, many lost their lives either at the plant or in the days and months that followed. The first crew to arrive was employed by the plant itself. Lieutenant Vladimir Pryet would later report that he and his crew immediately knew something had gone wrong when they heard the fire explosions at the plant, and when they saw smoke rising from the reactor building, they got dressed, jumped in a fire engine, and sped to the scene. But they had no idea that the reactor had exploded, and instead expected a much smaller fire. Upon arriving at the plant, Pryet was informed of the true nature of the disaster, and he immediately called for all firefighters in the region to assist. Being familiar with the plant, Pryet and his men knew that the reactor building's roof contained asphalt, which was highly combustible. The asphalt had spread to other areas in the building as a result of the explosion, and so a series of smaller fires had broken out that also needed to be dealt with. But they weren't informed that the plant's fuel rods had exploded, resulting in a uranium dioxide and graphite fire that was emitting deadly radiation. At the time, between 20,000 and 30,000 rem was being released. A dose of 400 rem is considered lethal, and these first responders are being exposed to several times that amount. But dosimeters used at the plant could only read levels up to 3.6 Roentgen per hour, and it was mistakenly assumed that this was the amount of radiation being released into the atmosphere. The reality was that as much as 7 times that amount of radiation was present, but there were also other obstacles that needed to be dealt with. As a result of the explosion, all of the plant's firefighting equipment was rendered inoperable, and firefighters had no choice but to use a fire escape to run hoses up to the roof. But an hour later, Pryet and several of his crew had to be rescued from the building when their muscles started to weaken and they became violently ill. It was reported that Pryet's eyes had changed color thanks to his prolonged exposure to the radiation. All the while, there were concerns that the fire would spread to the nearby reactor number 3, and more firefighters started arriving. They knew that their lives were in imminent danger, but they kept to their task, entering the toxic building one after another to douse the flames. In the hours and days that followed, many of these first responders were taken to the nearby Pryet hospital, where many succumbed to the radiation sickness. Those who lost their lives were buried in lead-lined coffins to prevent further spreading of the radiation that they'd been exposed to. Today, that hospital stands abandoned like so many other buildings in the area, and in its basement, the clothing belonging to those firefighters still remains, since it's too dangerous to remove these items from the building. Officially, about 31 people lost their lives as a direct result of the Chernobyl disaster, but this is a number that most people disagree with. Residents of Pryet and other surrounding towns and villages were also exposed to radiation, and it's estimated that another 4,000 people will eventually lose their lives as a result. It's believed that the very first person to lose his life in the disaster was 35-year-old Valery Kodemchuk, who was employed at the plant as an engineer. He had just finished serving in the military at the time that the Chernobyl plant was being built, and when it was completed, he applied for a position there. He got the job and worked his first shift at the plant in September of 1973 as an engineer of boilers. He worked his way up to senior engineer of boilers and underground communications, but by the time the disaster occurred in 1986, he'd been appointed as the senior operator of the main circulation pump. He'd been working at the plant for 13 years by this point and knew Reactor 4 better than most. He was working a shift on the night of the meltdown, and he was informed that a test would be conducted that night to determine how long the reactor turbine would continue to function in the event of an accidental power outage. At first, things seemed to be going to plan, and Kodemchuk was told to wait at the reactor core so that he could relay what he was seeing during the test, and once it had been successfully completed. At 1:23 a.m., the reactor's power had been stabilized at 200 megawatts, and Kodemchuk waited in the 3-story pump room, which was located next to the reactor vault. He was monitoring the water inlet valves and pumps that were filled with water just below the boiling point. 164 of the 211 control rods had been lifted out of the reactor core to increase the plant's power output, after it had been lowered to a very dangerous level. The next step was to lower the rods again, and it was expected that the nuclear reaction rate would be decreased. But instead, the lowering of the rods, which were graphite-tipped, resulted in a surge of power that no one expected, and just seconds later, the explosion occurred that blew the reactor's roof off and exposed the reactor core. Kodemchuk was the closest person to the explosion, and it's thought that he lost his life instantly. No attempts were made to retrieve his remains, since doing so would have proven fatal to anyone entering the area where he was working. After the explosion at Chernobyl occurred, Reactor 4's rooftop was said to be the most dangerous place on the entire planet, since radiation levels reached tens of thousands of Roentgens. We've since learned that vehicles used during the cleanup operation following the disaster had to be abandoned since they'd been irradiated, and clothing worn by cleanup crew members also had to be discarded for the same reason. But there's one item that's still present in the forest surrounding the plant that most people wouldn't dare venture close to. Known as the Claw of Death, this piece of machinery was used to clean up exploded graphite and other radioactive materials that had spread to the roofs of the surrounding reactors in the wake of the blast. Needless to say, since these materials were extremely radioactive and unimaginably dangerous, much of that radiation was transferred to the Claw, and it'll remain in that state for many more years to come. Once its task was complete, the Claw was removed from the crane to which it was attached, and not knowing what to do with it since it was so dangerous, cleanup crews decided to dump it in the forest where it still remains today. The hope was that it would become buried in the forest's soil, in falling foliage, but unfortunately this was not the case. Only one archaeologist, Robert Maxwell, who hails from Sydney, Australia, has ever worked at the Chernobyl site since the meltdown. He's painted a clear picture of what happened at the plant during the explosion, stating that when it occurred, it blew the reactor's roof straight up in the air before it came crashing down vertically into the resulting hole. Since the roof weighed between 6 and 10 tons, it became clear what the force of the explosion was, and unsurprisingly it sent debris, including the control rods, fuel rods, and graphite, flying through the air, after which it came to rest on the roofs of neighboring reactors. It was then correctly determined that anyone who ventured onto these roofs would lose their lives very quickly, and hence the Claw was brought in to remove the radioactive materials. Each piece of debris that was removed was then lowered back into the exposed reactor core, since there was nowhere else for it to be dumped safely. But this was not the original plan. First, cleanup crews tried to remove the debris with the use of robots, and when that failed, one of the Soviet Union's lunar rovers was brought in. But in the end, the Claw was found to be most effective. The robots, one of which was borrowed from West Germany, lasted just a few minutes on the roof before the radiation rendered it useless. This robot was also eventually left in a forest, though it should be noted that this was a different forest from the one where the Claw was located. The other robots were also dumped around the exclusion zone, where they can still be found today. When Maxwell found out about the Claw, he became determined to find it, and with the help of a guide, he did just that. Upon seeing it for the first time, he was surprised to find that it hadn't been cordoned off like the other radioactive materials in the forest, and when he took a radiation reading of the piece of machinery, he was shocked to learn that if anyone came into contact with it for even just a few seconds, they would start suffering from radiation sickness. He's of the opinion that the Claw will remain in this exact spot forever, since no one will ever be willing to go near it to remove it. He's since written about the Claw and suggests that anyone who visits the exclusion zone stay as far away from it as they can. When discussing the Chernobyl disaster, most people are aware that the plant, the exclusion zone, and the surrounding communities were eventually evacuated and that these areas will not be habitable again for thousands of years. Thus, they're surprised to learn that in the aftermath of the meltdown, the remaining 3 reactors remained in operation for years. It also isn't common knowledge that at the time, the Soviet Union was in the process of constructing 2 more reactors at the site, but understandably they were never created. But Units 1 through 3 remained in operation, but not without difficulty. Before any work could continue in these buildings, they had to be made safe. All the debris from the neighboring explosion had to be removed to ensure the safety of the staff working at the plant, and the mere fact that they were willing to return to work in this dangerous area, it seems almost unthinkable. The first of the remaining reactors to have issues was number 2. A fire broke out in the building's turbine hall in 1991, thanks to a faulty switch on one of the turbines. The turbine hull was badly damaged as a result, and the reactor was shut down. As for reactor number 1, it was shut down in 1996 when the decision was made to decommission it following an agreement between Ukraine and the European Union for it to be shut down in exchange for modernizing the containment chamber that had been installed over reactor number 4. Following the disaster and the fire at reactor number 2, Western countries started pleading with Ukraine to shut down reactor number 3. But the Ukrainian government decided to renege on their agreement to shut down all the reactors. But in 2000, they decided to decommission the building in exchange for social and financial assistance from the West. Following this, plans started falling into place for the entire Chernobyl plant to be dismantled. Used fuel still present in the reactors will need to be removed safely and safely stored. Any waste products resulting from the dismantling process will need to be treated for radiation, and once this is done, they'll need to be stored somewhere where no one will have access to them. It's believed that this project will be completed by 2064, and that it'll be tackled in 6 stages. First, the plant's water supply will need to be overhauled, after which the control and protection units, as well as the pressure tubes, will need to be dismantled. Reactor 1 and 2 will have their cores placed into maintenance mode, after which they'll be left alone so that any remaining radiation can dissipate. Next, the roofs of reactors 1 and 2 will be overhauled, and the fuel-containing machines in these buildings will be taken apart. Unit 3 will then be shut down and left to stand while the radiation decays, after which its roof will be overhauled and its machinery will then be dismantled and removed. It's estimated that this project will cost billions of dollars, but it's a small price to pay to have the surrounding areas livable once again. When the true scale of the Chernobyl disaster was finally revealed to the rest of the world, there was great concern for the people living in the areas around the plant, and with good reason. Inexplicably, the government decided not to evacuate these areas immediately, and as a result, many people have started suffering from radiation sickness, while others have lost their lives for that same reason. But as is human nature, concerns didn't end with the residents of the area, as many people started wondering what would be done with the wildlife living around the plant, since these animals couldn't simply be evacuated. In the decades since, scientists have recorded some very surprising data about these animals. It's been discovered that most of the wildlife and even plants in the forests surrounding the plant somehow managed to not only survive but thrive in extremely toxic conditions. Some fungi have adapted and are now using the radiation as a type of fuel, while some animals have also managed to adapt to their surroundings. But these changes are noticeable. The leaves on certain trees in one area of the forest have turned bright red instead of green, and one species of frog now has black skin instead of green. But this is not the case for all the animals living there. Some species have suffered from mutations that caused their numbers to decline rapidly, and some of those that remain have suffered from health problems, which comes as no surprise given the damage done to their environment. At the time of the disaster, it was known that several packs of stray dogs were living in the areas around the plant, and that their health would also be at risk. But in the decades that have passed, they remain in these areas, giving scientists a unique opportunity to study the effects that the radiation has had on them. More than 300 of these dogs have been studied by scientists from the University of South Carolina and the National Human Genome Research Institute, and their findings have taken the scientific community by surprise. This study aimed to determine whether these dogs had undergone any kind of mutations, and to find relevant data, the stray dogs were compared to others living about 10 miles outside the exclusion zone in Chernobyl City. They found distinct differences in the genetics of the two groups, and while this suggests that these dogs are indeed mutating, researchers have stated that this is not necessarily the case, since the study is still in its infancy. Other factors, such as inbreeding, need to be taken into consideration, since this can also have an adverse effect. But the study will serve as a good starting point from where scientists may be able to start studying larger mammals, such as the bears and different species of deer that are still living in the forests. Since different packs of dogs have been exposed to different levels of radiation, more time is needed to complete this initial study. And in time, we will hopefully learn how these animals were able to survive the exclusion zone, and whether they'll continue to thrive in the years to come. In February of 1986, 2 months before the Chernobyl disaster occurred, the Minister of Power and Electrification of Ukraine, Vitaly Sklyarov, sat down with a reporter from the Soviet English-language magazine Soviet Life to discuss the country's power industry and the work being done at Chernobyl. The article starts by explaining that Ukraine at the time generated 260 billion kilowatt hours of electricity every year, 15% of which was nuclear generated. This equated to about 20% of the power generated by the Soviet Union overall. Sklyarov stated that the Ukrainian government was in the process of constructing large power generating complexes, and that construction of these units was already underway. He added that another power plant was also being built in western Ukraine, along with another being constructed on the Crimean Peninsula. When these projects were completed, it would mean that Ukraine would become the first ever Soviet republic to possess commercial nuclear power. These plants, Sklyarov stated, would aid in providing power to Odessa, where more than 1 million people were living at the time. It was also planned for the heat from the power plant's exhaust system to be used in the growing of mushrooms, fruit, and other vegetables, as well as aiding with fish and poultry farming in the Crimean region, since warm water could be used to irrigate fields. The interviewer, Maxim Rilsky, then made mention of the fact that these nuclear power plants were being constructed close to big cities and raised areas. He then asked what the risks were that came with these plants being situated so close to populated areas. Sklyarov replied that there was no need for concern, since the chances of a nuclear meltdown were about 1 in every 10,000 years, thanks to the safety controls that were in place at each of the plants. He also stated that new, more reliable equipment was being developed, and once the project was complete, the equipment would be installed, ensuring that these facilities became even safer than they were before. The article was intended to be a congratulatory piece, as it outlined the safety of Soviet nuclear power and the benefits that the Chernobyl plant brought to the nearby town of Pryet. But just 2 months later, the town was completely abandoned when the disaster occurred, and today it serves as more of a reminder that just one false step at one of these plants could have consequences that will be felt for thousands of years to come. Many lessons have been learned in the aftermath of the Chernobyl disaster. It's clear that on that night, there was a lack of communication between staff members and their superiors, and more importantly, of the dangers that were present during the safety test that was being conducted. In the days following the meltdown, the Soviet Union neglected to inform its citizens and the rest of the world of the magnitude of the disaster. And today, it's believed that thousands of lives could have been saved if this had been done in time. While this may seem like common sense to most of us, keep in mind that the Cold War was still underway, and that the Soviet Union could have done pretty much anything in its power to keep the embarrassing news of the meltdown from reaching the rest of the world. We've also since learned what to expect if such a disaster were to occur again, but no one expected that the incident would result in the discovery of a completely new technogenic compound called Chernobylite. Those who've researched the Chernobyl disaster will be very familiar with the elephant's foot, a mass of silicon dioxide, uranium, calcium, zirconium, aluminum, magnesium, and potassium that formed at the base of the plant's reactor, and which remains massively radioactive to this day. The elephant's foot was created thanks to an unfortunate series of events during the safety test. The plant's cooling systems were shut down intentionally, and at first everything went to plan. But when the graphite-tipped rods were inserted back into the reactor core, something went catastrophically wrong. The fission reaction quickly spiraled out of control, and as a result, so much heat was released that the fuel rods started to melt along with their cases, the core containment vessel, and the reactor building's concrete floor. Uranium oxide is present in the fuel pellets used in the fuel rods, and those pellets are encased in zirconium alloys. When the resulting fire reached about 2200 degrees Fahrenheit, all of these materials started to melt, and the resulting puddle became a type of radioactive lava. The mass then started burning through the reactor's steel structure and foundations, traveling at about 12 inches every hour. The concrete floor broke down into silicates, aluminum, and magnesium, which made the mass more viscous, allowing it to flow more freely. Once this was discovered, fears started to rise that the mass would burn through the entire structure and into the groundwater below, which would have further exacerbated the disaster. But in the end, the puddle stopped traveling after about 9 feet, once its temperature dipped to about 2,000 degrees Fahrenheit. 10 years later, scientists were finally able to study the elephant's foot, and it was found that corium had been formed, but this was expected. But to their surprise, they discovered that a then unknown uranium zirconium silicate was also present inside the corium. Since it contained uranium and had been affected by fission products, the material was extremely radioactive, and it's believed that it'll remain in this state for decades or even centuries. The residents of Pryet, the closest city to the Chernobyl power plant, were none the wiser that their lives were in danger on the morning following the meltdown. They'd gotten a word that something had gone awry at the plant, but were assured that it was merely a minor incident and that they needed not worry about it. But before it was evacuated, the town was seen as a great achievement by the Soviet Union. It was purpose-built as a modern city and served as a model for the Soviet government, since residents enjoyed a high standard of living and modern amenities. Most of its residents were relatively young, many of whom were employed by the plant. By all accounts, it was an ideal place to raise a family, and it was considered a prestigious area that contained many conveniences that were lacking in other areas of Ukraine. The city had a total of 167 buses that were available to the public. The main bus station was located on Lenin Avenue, which is the route most people took to get to the city center. It also served as the main transportation hub to Kiev. In photos that have been taken since the disaster, it's now overrun by flora, and the building itself is a husk of its former self, since it's completely abandoned, and nature has started reclaiming it. Photos of the city's post office show that it once contained a massive painting on one of its walls. It was a peaceful scene containing doves and cosmonauts, along with other pieces of technology, symbolizing the opinion that the Soviet Union was superior to the rest of the world. It also contained a room with several phone booths that members of the public could use while visiting the post office. It served as a means of contacting family and loved ones for residents who did not have a phone in their homes. The colorful painting is still visible in the building today, but it stands among debris inside the ruins of the structure that has started to crumble and fall apart, which is expected since it's not been in use for decades. One of the more picturesque areas of the city was known as Café Pryet. It was located next to a lake, and on most days, people could be seen gathering there with their friends. It was known locally as the Dish, a reference to the saucer-shaped observation deck that afforded them a good view of the water and the sailboats that drifted by in the summer months. When winter arrived, the lake would freeze over completely, after which it was used for ice skating. But today, none of these activities are possible, as the cafe is now completely overrun by plant life. Lenin Square was once a bustling area. The Palace of Culture was visited by many tourists, and Palisa Hotel would see many guests each year, but they've all been abandoned. But perhaps one of the more poignant sights in the city is the communal swimming pool named Azure. Before the disaster, it was a place where families would spend their leisure days, but in the months after the meltdown, it was used by liquidators, workers who had the unenviable task of cleaning up the contaminated debris that was left behind by the explosion at the plant. It remained filled and in use for 12 years after Pryet was abandoned, and only in 1998 was it abandoned when the liquidators had completed their task. Today, the diving boards, sports hall, and other amenities stand unused, but it remains one of the cleanest areas in the entire city and has been featured in video games such as Call of Duty 4. We now know that the Chernobyl disaster occurred due to several factors, two of the most prominent being a lack of safety culture and errors made by operators at the plant that night. While these factors certainly had a hand in causing the explosion, they were by no means the only cause, and when studies were conducted after the fact, it came to light that the biggest factor leading to the meltdown of reactor number 4 was its poor design. In the aftermath of the disaster, Soviet scientists blamed the accident solely on human error, and while it isn't known whether these claims were being made sincerely, they were later forced to admit that this was only a minor contributing factor. The Chernobyl reactors were of the RBMK type, a design that had been rejected by the rest of the world, since it seemingly didn't conform to accepted safety standards in the West and other nuclear power-producing countries. No other country on Earth has ever constructed an RBMK reactor, and given the events that took place at Chernobyl in 1986, it's likely this design will never be used again. One of the main issues with this design was that the reactor would act strangely when it started up and shut down. According to reports, it will become unstable during these times, thanks to the use of graphite instead of water to slow down neutrons, as was being done in the US. Furthermore, whenever anyone attempted to decrease the plant's power output, it would first produce a power spike that would often cause overheating issues, which would then produce even more power, the exact opposite of what it was supposed to do. Hence, when it was revealed by Soviet powers that human error was to blame for the disaster, Western scientists gathered at a symposium to dispute those claims. They knew that the plant was temperamental, and that the flaws in its design could just as likely have been to blame. It was known that operator error was a factor, but if the plant had been properly designed and maintained, these errors could have been corrected, rather than exacerbated by faulty equipment and a flawed design. It would later come to light that the plant's supervisors and managers were fully aware of the design flaws, and they'd been warned about the dangers as many as 9 years before the disaster occurred. According to Lord Walter Marshall, the head of Britain's power industry at the time, the British government had contacted the Soviet government and made their concerns known, but they were told that this was a misconception, and no changes were ever made. Marshall also stated that any nuclear power plant could be made safe if its staff were properly trained, but in the case of Chernobyl, even the most experienced operator would have failed thanks to the reactor's shoddy design. In the end, the main causes for the accident were found to be a positive void coefficient caused by neutrons being absorbed into the cooling system's water, and the fact that the graphite core ran hotter than the fuel used, a factor that was completely avoidable. The disaster at Chernobyl has turned the surrounding landscape into an uninhabitable zone that, according to scientists, will not be habitable again for the next 20,000 years. But that doesn't mean that the site isn't without interest, as is evidenced by the fact that the Russian military seized control of the exclusion zone on the 25th of February, 2022, after invading Ukraine. There's been no word on why this was done, but in the days following this, something strange happened that has not yet been explained, and according to many sources, no investigation has been launched to solve the mystery. The forest around Chernobyl has been fitted with more than 40 radiation sensors that cover a 1,000 square mile area in the exclusion zone. Just days after the zone was overrun by Russian forces, these sensors suddenly started to spike, indicating that radiation levels had inexplicably risen to dangerous levels. The Ukrainian government tried to explain this by claiming that it was the result of heavy military equipment moving through the area. They believed that this machinery then kicked up radioactive dust that made the area even more dangerous, and Ukraine blamed Russia for creating an unnecessary risk, stating that they condemned these actions. But not everyone was convinced. UK scientists explored this theory and found it to be completely implausible. This led to yet another theory being put forward, that the sensors had somehow been hacked. Other similar sensors have shown certain vulnerabilities in their software, and experts started to wonder whether the Chernobyl sensors may have had this same weakness, allowing someone to hack them and then produce false and alarming readings. A security researcher called Ruben Santamarta studied the sensor data from before the spikes occurred and compared it with the data after the invasion, and immediately became suspicious. He found that all the spikes had occurred between 8:40 p.m. and 10:50 a.m. on the 24th and 25th of February. Each time a spike was recorded, either 7, 9, or 11 sensors spiked at the same time, and they would all return to normal within 2 hours. While this may not seem suspicious, it was the fact that these sensors produced the same readings at the same time, and were all situated miles away from each other, that caused confusion, since they were very unlikely to all produce the same data simultaneously. This, along with other pieces of data, showed that the spiked readings could not have been caused by an increase in radiation levels, and he started to believe that the data had been purposefully manipulated, but had no idea by whom. He suggested that it was either done by someone who had access to the server that is used to produce the sensor data, or that the hacker had somehow managed to take control of the sensors to make it seem as though the area was once again irradiated, but the reason for this remains unclear. It's been suggested that the spikes were faked by the Ukrainian government in an effort to deter Russian soldiers from occupying the exclusion zone, since the area would have been extremely dangerous and toxic if the spikes were authentic, but this has not been proven. In the wake of the explosion at Chernobyl, as many as 350,000 people were evacuated, and the exclusion zone, which stretches almost 3,000 miles in diameter, was established. At the time, it was thought that the area would never recover, and that due to high levels of radiation, it would eventually become an uninhabitable wasteland. But this wasn't quite the case. While the area certainly isn't safe for humans to occupy, many animals and plant species have managed to survive and even thrive despite living in an area that contains high levels of radiation. Many of the school blocks, schools, houses, and stores that were once filled with residents, students, and products now stand abandoned, and in the decades since the disaster have become overgrown with foliage. Animals have been observed taking shelter in some of these buildings, and despite all predictions, seem to be mostly unaffected by the radiation. This includes one specific species of horse, called Przewalski's horses, so named after Russian Colonel Nikolai Przewalski, who found one of these horses' skull and skin in 1881. Many researchers believe that this was the last species of truly wild horse in the world, but there weren't many left since humans had overhunted and overpopulated the species in Mongolia and China, and it was thought that the last of these wild horses was living in the Gobi Desert in 1969, with about 12 more living in captivity. Luckily, a breeding program was started, and the species was brought back from the brink of extinction. In modern times, we know of about 2,000 Przewalski horses that live in Europe and parts of Asia, but most surprising is the fact that many of those live in Chernobyl's exclusion zone. The horses aren't native to the area, but 10 males and 18 females were brought there in 1998. Just 5 years later, their numbers had increased to 65. But poachers unfortunately lessened these numbers once more, and in 2007 only 30 were thought to have survived. This led to strict conservation measures being put in place, and by 2018 their numbers reached 150, when 22 foals were born in that year alone. These horses usually prefer living in big, open, unforested areas, but in Chernobyl they've adapted and learned how to live in the area's forests. Some even prefer to live in the areas that are being worst affected by radiation, a fact that has left scientists baffled since we're unable to explain why they remain unaffected by it. This has left us with a lot of questions, including whether the radiation levels are actually lower than first thought, and whether the Przewalski horses are somehow able to quickly repair any cellular damage caused by radiation. For now, it remains a mystery until further research can be conducted, and hopefully this will teach us more about the exclusion zone and when it will be habitable once again. The word liquidator usually conjures up images of someone arriving at a business to close it down and then sell all of its assets after the company went belly up and is no longer able to be saved. But when it comes to Chernobyl, this word has a completely different meaning. It's used to describe a group of between 300 and 600,000 people that somehow managed to liquidate the radiation that was leaking out of the building in the wake of the disaster. They came from all walks of life. Some were firemen, others were miners, and others still were soldiers serving in the military at the time. They're hailed as heroes of the disaster, but for many, their selfless acts came at a harrowing price. Of those hundreds of thousands of liquidators, as many as 40,000 passed away as a direct result of the work they performed at the plant. But years after the fact, it's estimated that as many as 70,000 of the surviving liquidators are now disabled, and unfortunately most of their names are forgotten to history, despite putting their lives on the line to save millions more. Many of those who became sick after working at the disaster tried to receive treatment from the government, but in many cases their illness was shrugged off as an unrelated illness, and they were left to fend for themselves. The dangers that the liquidators faced in the weeks following the explosion were immeasurable, as one firefighter, a man named Igor, recalls. He was tasked with evacuating people from the area, after which he helped remove radioactive topsoil that caused further danger. He describes the process of removing topsoil as similar to rolling up a carpet. Thousands of miles were removed and dumped into open pits, which he states weren't lined with any type of protective material, leading many people to believe that the exercise was useless. He reported that once his task was complete, he and his fellow workers were told not to have any children for at least 5 years, but many were unwilling to relay this information to their spouses, and they had children regardless. Another liquidator, called Alexander Lashenko, who spent 30 days working in the exclusion zone as a chemistry specialist, reported that many people who worked alongside him were exposed to far higher levels of radiation that affected them badly in the years to come. Of the 400 people that he worked with, only 120 survived. He believes that this is due to a misunderstanding of how protective clothing was to be used. People who were working in high radiation areas were given improper protective gear, but those in the lower radiated areas worked only in their military uniforms. He also experienced long-lasting effects as a result, but considers himself to be one of the lucky ones, since he managed to survive for decades after the incident. He also spoke about the mechanics who worked at the site, who were tasked with repairing special military vehicles. Since the vehicles had also been irradiated, they were only allowed to work on each one for a certain period of time. But when they encountered an unexpected problem, they exceeded this limit and were exposed to far too much radiation. Within a month, 5 of the mechanics had lost their lives as a result, and all of the survivors are now listed as disabled. Some still experience headaches on a daily basis, and it's safe to say that their lives have never and will never be the same. While nuclear power has transformed our planet into a far more convenient place to live, it also poses unimaginable dangers, as is evidenced by the Chernobyl disaster and the 2 atomic bombs that were dropped on Nagasaki and Hiroshima in Japan on the 6th and 9th of August 1945, respectively. The bombing of these 2 cities may have hastened the end of the Second World War, but to the people who still live there, the shadows of the people who once resided there serve as a cold reminder of one of the country's darkest days. The 2 explosions were so intense that the light and heat emitted in the process seared the shadows of many victims into sidewalks, buildings, and walls, or so it was thought at first. We now know that these shadows were caused when the light and heat from the explosion bleached the buildings and sidewalks around the victims, leaving the areas behind them untouched and resulting in a shape that resembles their shadows. Today, these types of shadows are still visible in both areas. Some show bicycles that were perched up against buildings. Others show the forms of people who were sitting on steps when the explosion occurred, and others resemble the shapes of ladders that were being used at construction sites. While the nuclear explosion at Chernobyl was no doubt extremely intense in heat and light alike, it didn't cause any of these shadows in the area. But a mysterious group of people have taken to the exclusion zone in the city of Pryet to add intentionally fake shadows that serve as a reminder of the many lives that were lost. Pryet is already somewhat of a creepy area in modern times, since it is completely abandoned. But the addition of these graffitied shadows adds even more of an ominous atmosphere to the city. One of these figures resembles 3 children playing in the streets, and upon closer inspection, it almost seems as though they're about to turn and run from the explosion, which was of course not the case since these murals were added much later. Another shows the image of a stag looking back over its shoulder, and it serves as a reminder of the animals that used to live in the exclusion zone, but that are now no longer present thanks to the disaster. There's also an image of a person holding their arms up against a door, another who seems to be in the process of kicking a soccer ball, and another much larger image of a young girl smiling while playing with what looks like a space hopper. One black and white image shows a table along with the chair that has fallen over, while others depict bears, flowers, and the faces of soldiers in tribute to those who remained in the area after the explosion to make it as safe as possible. While many of these images remain, many more have either faded and peeled away over time, or have been destroyed by vandals for reasons unknown. The graffiti that remains tells a story of a disaster that changed the world forever, but the artists that created these images remain largely unknown since they may face prosecution for these actions. But despite this, many people are thankful for the images, since they ensure that this tragedy and the lives that it took will not be forgotten. In the wake of the Chernobyl disaster, scientists and experts were left with a lot of questions since it was the biggest nuclear disaster that the world had ever seen, and hence we had no idea what the after effects would be. As mentioned earlier, it was believed that the entire exclusion zone would become an arid desert thanks to the massive amounts of radiation that were released, but surprisingly, most of the fauna in the area has survived. But there is one area that still leaves scientists perplexed, and today it's become known as the Red Forest, or the Rusty Forest. As the name suggests, it was a forested area where all the leaves on the pine trees have turned a bright shade of red. And while it's beautiful to look at, it is situated in one of the most dangerous areas in the exclusion zone, since radiation levels there are still very high. The Red Forest was one of the first areas to be hit when the explosion occurred, since it's located close to reactor number 4. Many of the trees were incinerated or immediately died from the radiation, but surprisingly, many trees survived and then started to turn red. In the weeks following the explosion, it was decided that these trees posed a significant threat, not only to those working in the area, but to other plants and animals too. And so it was decided that they needed to be cut down and destroyed. The worst case scenario, it was said, would have been if a fire were to break out in the forest, which was certainly a possibility. If this happened, it would likely have resulted in a nuclear cloud forming, and if a strong wind happened to be blowing, this cloud could have traveled hundreds of miles, causing even more damage and affecting even more lives. The trees that were removed were taken away and buried in trenches before being covered with sand. It's believed that this would stop the radiation that they contained from leaking out, but even those trenches will remain very dangerous for many years to come. It seemed as though this would be the end of the Red Forest, but seemingly that wasn't the case. Not long after, new saplings started to appear in the area, and quite unbelievably, their leaves also started to turn red due to the remaining radiation in the soil. Scientists have also found that the soil in this area is surprisingly fertile, and that the plants, as well as animals, such as the Suwalski horses, seem to thrive there against all odds and predictions. In fact, biodiversity in the forest is now higher than it was before the explosion, though this may be due to the fact that no humans are present in the area anymore, and hence they feel that it's a safe area to live and breed. Bears, wild boar, deer, wolves, and birds have been seen in the forest, despite it still being one of the most contaminated areas on the planet. Levels of up to 90% have been recorded in the soil, leaving experts baffled as to how these trees have been able to survive there for so long. It goes without saying that the exclusion zone at Chernobyl is off limits to the public, with the exception of some tourist groups that are allowed to enter if they're accompanied by a licensed tour guide, and adhere to the strict rules and regulations that have been put in place for visitors. Under no circumstances is anyone allowed to enter the area without permission, but this hasn't stopped some thrill seekers, often referred to as stalkers, from doing so anyway at the risk of their own lives. Many of these stalkers' identities remain a mystery, since they're taking part in an illegal activity, but a few have come forward to report what they have seen in the remnants of Pryet and the rest of the exclusion zone. One man named Dmitry, though this obviously isn't his real name, was just a child when the disaster happened, and throughout his childhood, he would hear stories about Chernobyl since he lived about 50 miles away. He knew that something bad had happened there and was told that the soil, water, and plants were all poisoned as a result, but it wouldn't be until years later that he fully understood what the Chernobyl disaster really was. He had always feared that a similar disaster would happen in his hometown, and that he and his family would be forced to move. On one occasion, his mother came home from work to find that he'd shut all the house's windows and doors before taping them shut. She explained that they were no longer in danger from the radiation that leaked from the plant, and so it came as a huge relief to learn that he no longer needed to worry. But his fear was soon replaced by fascination, and as the years passed, he felt that he needed to visit the exclusion zone to see it for himself. Dmitry admits that he developed an unhealthy obsession with this idea, and he started finding as much information about Chernobyl as he could. He visited libraries to read books and articles about the disaster, pored over maps of the exclusion zone, and visited countless websites dedicated to the subject. He was fascinated by photos of the abandoned buildings, the houses that were left untouched as their inhabitants fled, and he marveled over the fact that animals continued to live in this toxic environment, seemingly unaffected. Then in 2009, he and a group of friends decided that it was time to take a trip into the exclusion zone. They started an internet forum detailing their plans, and before long they were part of a group of about 20 people, all with the same goal in mind. One of the men in the group had visited the zone before, and he invited Dmitry and one of his friends to join him on his next trip. When the day finally came, they swam across a river to get to Pryet, and what Dmitry saw there took him by surprise. From the research he had done, he expected to see nothing but ruins of buildings, dilapidated schools, and abandoned stores. But what he saw were buildings that had been reclaimed by nature, as they were covered in ivy, trees, and plants. The group set up a camp, but found it hard to get any sleep since they had to be constantly on the lookout for authorities. They even made it to their destination, and in the end spent 4 days there, exploring the ruins and taking photos of the ghostly city and its surroundings. Since then, Dmitry has led hundreds of illegal treks into the exclusion zone, and he now knows Pryet better than his own hometown. He and his fellow stalkers continue to evade the authorities, and have managed to keep their identities a secret. According to scientists' best estimations, the exclusion zone at Chernobyl will remain uninhabited for tens of thousands of years, but efforts are still being made to contain the leak of radiation from the plant. This includes a huge structure that has been built over reactor number 4 to prevent leaks from occurring, the storing of used nuclear fuel in a facility that's used exclusively for this purpose, and monitoring radiation levels throughout the exclusion zone to ensure that they don't rise to dangerous levels. Water, soil, and air in the area are also constantly being monitored for the same reason. And while this is ongoing, more research is being done to develop technologies that could decontaminate the area by removing contaminated particles from the atmosphere. But while humans are doing their utmost to expedite this process, nature is seemingly also doing its part, since a type of black fungus has been found to have not only survived the disaster, but to be actively cleaning the areas where it thrives. What makes this fungus so strange is the fact that scientists working at the reactor started noticing it growing on the walls after the disaster, something that by all accounts should not have been possible. The walls of the reactor are incredibly dangerous since they contain massive amounts of radiation, but these dangerous areas are where the fungi seem to thrive the most for reasons that we don't yet understand. Most life forms that come into contact with these levels of radiation would perish in a very short period of time, but the fungus seems to not only prefer these conditions, but could be feeding off the radiation. It's thought that it uses the radiation in the same way other plants use sunlight for photosynthesis, turning the radiation into a means of survival rather than succumbing to it as it should. It's also since been learned that it, along with other types of black fungi, contain melanin, the pigment that is responsible for our hair, eye, and skin color. But rather than supply it with pigment and protect it from the sun as melanin does with humans, the fungus uses it to absorb the radiation that it encounters. It's then converted into energy, which it uses to grow and thrive in areas where most other plants would perish. The discovery has excited scientists since it's given them a new insight into how radiation can be used, even if there's currently no practical application for what they've learned. The Chernobyl disaster must have been utterly terrifying on the night that it occurred and the weeks that followed, not only to the personnel tasked with making the area safe once more, but also to the residents that lived in the area at the time. While every effort was made to evacuate the area as quickly as possible, there was still a lot of uncertainty as to how dangerous the surrounding area had become, and whether the accident had already started affecting people without their knowledge. But according to several people who worked in Chernobyl's control room, they encountered something in the days leading up to the disaster that left them terrified, and to this day they've been unable to find an explanation for it. A creature now called the Blackbird of Chernobyl was seen on several occasions in the sky over the plant, and by all accounts, these were harrowing experiences, though their description of the creature is somewhat confusing. They reported that it had glowing red eyes despite having no head, and that it was a dark-colored beast with massive wings that circled the skies above the plant, as if it was warning them of things to come. In the days that followed, those who'd seen the Birdman started having horrible nightmares, while others received strange, threatening phone calls, the source of which remains unknown. But this isn't the only time that the strange figure has been sighted. In 2007, people working around the plant also started seeing the Birdman, and once again they were plagued by disturbing dreams that left them too afraid to go back to sleep. These sightings were reported and mentioned through the ranks, but nothing could be done since the creature never stayed in one area for long enough to either be examined or attacked. Residents living in the nearby city of Pryet also reported seeing the creature at times, some of whom believed it to be the infamous Mothman that's said to be seen whenever a disaster is about to strike a certain area. The Mothman is a much better known creature among cryptozoologists, as it's been seen on hundreds of occasions, always before an earthquake, volcanic eruption, or man-made disaster takes place. Others believe that these are two separate creatures, but that they're both harbingers of doom, that for reasons unknown either try to warn us of impending disaster, or take a strange interest in these types of events. As for the Birdman, people are divided on what it is and why it appears. Some think it may be a time traveler of sorts that returns to these events out of morbid curiosity, while others think that it's a hoax that was devised to keep people out of the exclusion zone, not only for their own safety, but to stop looters from entering the area. There's no doubt that the Chernobyl disaster had an adverse effect on many of the survivors, some of whom have never recovered either physically or mentally. They were forced to flee their homes where their families had lived for generations, and were forced to start new lives somewhere else, all the while wondering whether they'd been affected by the radiation that had leaked out from the plant. But one group of Russian scientists saw the disaster, coupled with the fall of the Soviet Union, as an opportunity to start their own community on a Greek island called Gavdos. Their leader, a man who's simply named Andrei, is a survival of the Chernobyl disaster, and together they've created a self-sustaining commune away from the rest of the world. The group was given a piece of land, measuring about 7 acres in total by a priest, and they immediately started planting food, building houses and living off the land, free from the hustle and bustle of the outside world. But as time went by, less and less was known about the people living there. It's said that their isolation started affecting them as they started producing theories on immortality, and when it came to light that they wanted to transform the world, the Secret Intelligence Service was sent to the island to investigate, but found nothing suspicious. The scientists and the church on the island, run by the priest, live in harmony for more than 10 years now. But when the church found out that the community was searching the birth of a new, immortal human, the relationship understandably started to sour. They caused an uproar when it came to light that they were building a Greek temple on the island where they planned to follow the philosophies of Pythagoras, and that they were investigating ancient Greek mysteries that many people had never heard of before. Before long, the group's clandestine nature resulted in rumors being spread, as some people started speculating that they didn't travel to the island on their own accord, but were sent there to recover after coming into contact with massive amounts of radiation. Others speculated that they were actually part of a government agency, such as the KGB or CIA, and that they were sent to the island to work on a secret government program, the nature of which is unknown. Strangely, these theories were put forward by people who'd visited the island and who spoke to the scientists themselves, further cementing the fact that whatever is happening on the island is kept under wraps from outsiders. One researcher who's been to the island found information about the group's immortality theories, and according to him, it seems like a working scientific model, though it is still theoretical at best. He added that the theories put forward by the group are in no way based on religion or any type of esoteric belief, but rather rely on solid scientific research that's been conducted on the island since their arrival there. But in direct contrast to this, they followed the teachings of Greek philosophers and eventually finished building their temple, which is now named the Temple of Apollo. This has caused people in neighboring communities to consider them as heretics, especially since they at one point requested that a priest be sent to the island to pray to the Virgin Mary, so that they could receive help with the construction of the temple that's dedicated to a Greek god. For now, the strange commune remains a mystery, but for all we know, they might be on the brink of creating an immortal human, though the chances of this happening are very small. One can only imagine the level of panic and chaos that existed at Chernobyl on the night of the disaster and the days following it. People working at the plant were scrambling to contain fires, helping to evacuate their coworkers, and doing everything in their power to contain the damage that had already been done. But as was reported later, a few people took the time to look at the sky above the plant, and what they reported is interesting to say the least. One of these witnesses was Mikhail Veritsky, a senior dosimetrist with the Dosimetry Control Department. On the night of the disaster, he and a few people from his team raced to the site of the explosion, and while performing their duties there, they were all baffled by something that they saw in the sky. They reported that they saw a huge ball of fire, about 22 feet in diameter, burning above the plant, and it was immediately apparent to them that it was not caused by the blast, since it seemed to hover in place for a long time. He estimated that the fireball was about 800 feet from the reactor, and as he watched, he saw 2 red rays of light emerge from the fire and travel towards the 4th reactor. This continued for the next 3 minutes or so, but then the lights suddenly retracted and the object started flying to the northwest before completely disappearing from sight. Remarkably, as soon as the rays of light hit the reactor, it was noticed that radiation levels suddenly dropped by a factor of 4, and many of the scientists working there that night believed that if this didn't happen, a nuclear explosion would have taken place. Many people felt that this was an extraterrestrial craft that had traveled to Chernobyl, not only out of curiosity, but to stop such a blast from happening. But this was not the last time that such an object was seen in the sky above the plant. In 1989, the reactor once again started sending radiation into the atmosphere, and chaos erupted as efforts were made to contain it. A doctor who was working at the site would later report that he spotted an amber-colored craft in the sky that night, again at a time that radiation was proving to be a real danger. Then a year later, a reporter traveled to the site to take photos of the resulting destruction. He took several photos of the plant's machine shop, and at the time didn't notice anything strange around him. But that changed when he developed the film that he was using. In several of the photos, a strange object could be seen hovering above the hole in the reactor's roof, and he quickly realized that it looked eerily similar to the object that was described by both the doctor and Veritsky, who were both performing their duties there. While many people have speculated that Chernobyl was visited by extraterrestrials that were intent on saving as many lives as possible, many more think that they were at the site to reduce the damage that was being caused to our environment, rather than saving humans. Others think that there really were no UFOs in the area at all, and the objects were merely a figment of the witnesses' imaginations. But to date, these sightings have never been explained, and it seems unlikely that they ever will be.
It was in 1986 that one of the biggest events in history took place. It was the Chernobyl accident, an unforeseen explosion that sent many fleeing the area as radiation leaked into the surroundings. Now it lies mostly abandoned, serving more as a ghost hunter attraction site. Although it's one of the most notable catastrophic events, the Chernobyl disaster is also one that's plagued by misinformation. Each source contradicts the last. Films spread fallacies, and novels serve as nothing more than fiction. This has left many digging for the truth, not knowing what reports to trust or what people to listen to. Among the biggest misconceptions of all is one that claims how the disaster occurred. The story goes that on that fateful eve, one of the workers had been near Reactor 4, the unit that would later explode. He spotted something that shouldn't have been happening. The reactor, or fuel caps, were bouncing up and down. The movement was no doubt alarming and sent the worker rushing through the corridors and into the control room to inform the others. Then, the AZ-5, an emergency protection button that was designed to quickly shut down the reactor, was pushed. Moments later, fire erupted from the reactor, sending emergency units flocking to the site to douse the raging flames. This sequence of events spread far and wide, and made its way into articles and informative pieces, marketed as the true story of the disaster. Except there was nothing true about it. Loose reactor caps were not the cause of the event. In fact, it was almost impossible for this to be the case. The myth had stemmed from a book called The Truth About Chernobyl, a novel written by Grigory Medvedev. Medvedev once worked at the nuclear power plant and was on the scene within days of its occurrence. In his book, he would describe the explosion from the testimony of an eyewitness. But the testimonials were a fallacy, and Medvedev's book was wrong. The mechanics of the caps would not have allowed for such a thing to happen. They're built with a threaded stopper placed beneath them. This screws into the core, ultimately creating a hermetic seal. The pressure emanating from the core adds to the suction, much like that of an airplane door. Adding to the skepticism surrounding Medvedev's claims is that his eyewitness would have to break the sound barrier if he were to make it from the reactor all the way to the control room before the explosion occurred. This would have been absolutely impossible to achieve, according to several investigations into the idea. The general concept that the author was suggesting, though, was not far off. He was proposing design flaws and human error, which is precisely what contributed to the eventual catastrophe. Number 9. In modern times, the site of an unimaginable disaster becomes an attraction point. Content creators, tourists, and journalists view these abandoned towns as an opportunity for a story. Chernobyl and the town of Pryet are no strangers to this very affair. The spookiness of the abandoned plant and neighboring town make it all the more intriguing. Some come to find ghosts, mutants, or the leftovers of a once bustling area. But according to one idea, going to Chernobyl comes at a cost. It's nothing of monetary value, but rather at the price of health. It's been suggested that the exclusion zone is so heavily toxic and dangerous that spending even a single day there would lead to radiation sickness, even after so many years have passed. Social media has become the driver of this misconception, where many believe that visitors of the exclusion zone will meet their untimely demise not long after. But the reason that so many believe this myth is because it seems like the most plausible scenario. Chernobyl was a massive disaster where radiation spewed into the environment, latching onto leaves, absorbing into the ground, and lingering in the atmosphere. It's only natural to assume that it's not safe. In actuality, though, taking a day trip to the site will not bring any more harm than a full-body X-ray. There's a reason that those X-ray technicians quickly run out of the room to stand behind a protective shield before starting the procedure. The whole-body X-ray scan can typically produce 300 times more radiation than that of visiting Chernobyl. Exposure at the power plant is also comparable to the several hours spent on an airplane, where cosmic radiation coming from space is plentiful. In numbers, the gamma radiation that one would be subjected to in one day near the nuclear power plant is between 2 and 4 microsieverts. Comparatively, in other such plants across the globe, generally the suggested safety limit for employees is 50 to 100 microsieverts. Although the exposure of a visit to the disaster site is relatively low, that doesn't mean the entire area is completely safe to venture into. There are sections that see a higher dose of contamination, and visitors are warned not to go into these areas, especially within the tighter exclusion zone perimeter. Aside from these exceptions, it's safe to take that explorative trip to Chernobyl. Undoubtedly, contamination is still present at the site, and cleanup operations are still underway. There are numerous workers who tend to this issue on a daily basis and then rotate their shifts every 3 months. Number 8. Sometime in the early months of 1986, an exciting announcement was made. It was that an amusement park was going to open in Pryet. It saw all the regular features of a fairground. It had a large Ferris wheel, bumper cars, small coasters, and all sorts of other fun rides. The residents were excited for the official opening day, May 1st. But as we know, that day would never come. Just days before the fairgrounds could open, the Chernobyl nuclear power plant sent a wave of chaos sweeping through the town. Now, the abandoned amusement park is overgrown, blackened, and blending in with the rest of the ghost town, never to be used. This feature serves as one of the icons of Pryet, which lay in a state of disrepair, merged into the prevalent silence. Although decrepit, aged, and forsaken, the fairgrounds have attracted many adventure seekers, just like an abandoned house would. Tourists have flocked to the area to witness for themselves the heartbreak left in the wake of the disaster. The residents were looking forward to a park that would never operate. Or did it? Given the timing of the disaster, it's easy to understand where the misconception comes from that the Pryet Ferris wheel never got to turn on. The concept didn't stem from one singular point. It was just something that was assumed by the globe that opening an amusement park would be the last thing on anyone's mind following a nuclear fallout event. But the aged photographs of that very unopened entertainment area serve as a testament against the narrative that it never operated. Those photographs reveal how the residents of Pryet congregated around the wheel, awaiting their turn. It was one day after the disaster that the fairground was open, which may come as a shock until you learn the heartwarming reason behind it. 36 hours after the catastrophic event had taken place, evacuation procedures began. That was a long time for anyone to be left in a ruined town, as fires raged and people became displaced. The residents were of all ages, from toddlers to the elderly, all of whom were in a state of panic and grief. Rescue personnel had witnessed the fear firsthand, and so as evacuations continued, it was decided that a distraction was needed. So on the 27th of April, 1986, the Ferris wheel ran in test mode, keeping the residents distracted and entertained. But it turned out that this wasn't the only time that the Ferris wheel had been rotating with people on board. The oldest photo, taken by Pryet inhabitants, was taken in the winter of February of that year. Carrying a few people, the Ferris wheel spun slowly, operating in test mode even before the accident. These photos were enough to put the whole Ferris wheel never used misconception to rest. Former residents of the ghost town also serve as a testament to this, suggesting that they witnessed the amusement park in operation, although it never opened officially to the public. Following the Chernobyl disaster, the Ferris wheel spun for a final time, and only for one day for the residents. Eventually, Pryet was abandoned and so was the fairground, allowing nature to reclaim the section. Number 7. In the wake of the Chernobyl catastrophe, people fled their homes, businesses, and schools, leaving behind an ashen scene. Anything that stood within the blast radius was reduced to dust. Pryet and the areas surrounding Chernobyl were left dark, empty, and soulless. In the days to follow, yellow triangles were hammered into the ground, the ones bearing the trefoil, a warning to anyone that may enter that this was now the home of radiation. Those signs would remain there for years to come, hinting at the danger within this lifeless wasteland, as so many considered it. Given the extent of the event, Chernobyl was viewed as a mass grave, a cemetery haunted by the ghosts of people that once lived there. Many wouldn't dare to venture into this radioactive desert, the forgotten town of Pryet, or into the exclusion zone, where life ceases to exist. This is the picture that many have painted in their head from the mere mention of nuclear power plant, or Chernobyl. But the reality is far more delightful than that. Behind this lugubrious misconception emerges a very lively realm, and it all begins with self-settlers. During the evacuation efforts, 116,000 people were removed from what would become known as the exclusion zone. But among them, more than 1,000 residents opted to stay and were duly named self-settlers. Although their population has decreased over the years, their demise was not caused by the wasteland that they decided to live on. In fact, they were able to live off of this supposed desert. They grew food and raised livestock here against all odds. Pets that were abandoned by their fleeing owners also remained here. Though claims suggest that they have mutated genes, they still make up part of a thriving environment. Foxes, horses, rabbits, wolves, birds, and several other species also call this place home, although they're seeing slight evolutionary changes, allowing them to cope with the radiation. Despite the seemingly arid, radioactive soil, trees, shrubs, grass, and vines have popped up, wrapping around buildings and reclaiming the area. But it wasn't always like this. For about 5 to 7 years after the harrowing event, trees produced no new seeds. Soil dwellers saw a reduced population. Horses and cows met an untimely end through damaged thyroids, and the rodent population declined too. As time lapsed on, though, the ecosystem seemingly began to heal, encouraging threatened animals to take up residence there and new species of plants to grow. The Chernobyl exclusion zone has become quite the nature reserve. The World Health Organization even claimed that the accident paradoxically led to a unique sanctuary for flora and fauna. Scientists studying the effects that the disaster had on nature revealed that there is an abundance of animal life, including elk, deer, boar, and bears. There are over 400 species of vertebrates, including 67 types of fish, 11 amphibians, 7 reptiles, 251 birds, and 73 mammals. Although there's this surge in population, that's not to say that the radiation hasn't had an impact on wildlife, but those negative effects are small enough to be difficult to find supporting evidence for. An example of this, also serving as another misconception, is the allegations of birds developing cataracts, which has widely been criticized by the larger scientific community. Number 6. It was just after 1:25 in the early morning hours. The flames were leaping at 600 feet around Reactor 4's hull. The night crew at Fire Station 2 of the Chernobyl plant rushed around as the alarm sounded. In the telephone room, a status board decorated with several red lamps lit up from top to bottom. This indicated that something grave was underway. It was the Chernobyl disaster. The fire engines screeched to a halt at the nuclear power plant as the crew watched the burning wreckage. Chunks of graphite littered the ground, and they knew exactly where it was coming from. The firemen were just one of several other liquidators, the emergency responders who arrived at the scene to douse the flames and contain the chaos. Among them were plant workers, military personnel, miners, construction workers, engineers, and volunteers. All of them had flocked there to see what they could do to help and participate in the cleanup. These liquidators were responsible for clearing radioactive debris, constructing the sarcophagus, burying contaminated materials, and ensuring that none of the other reactors suffered the same fate. It was during these containment efforts that several liquidators would lose their lives. Firefighters climbed to the top of the reactor to fight the flames, but wouldn't emerge alive. From the turbine hull, gamma and neutron radiation were being emitted by the lumps of uranium fuel. Radiation at this point was at a fatal dose. Anyone within the field of 400 Röntgen for 1 hour would absorb it and ultimately be doomed to suffer the health effects for years to come. Many of these responders wore minimal protective gear. And so once the chaos had dissipated, the first victims began to make their way to their graves. 30 holes were dug in a cemetery in Moscow, where the liquidator victims would be buried. But it was here that another myth would fill the air, even corroborated by some of the first responders and witnesses. They claimed that the bodies of the deceased were so radioactive that they needed to be buried in coffins made from lead, with the lids needing to be welded shut, preventing more radiation from spewing out into the environment. Again, it seemed plausible that this would be the case. They were the first on the scene, and the first to receive that fatal dose of toxicity. But again, this wasn't true. By the time the victims had passed on, the radiation had become so strong that it dried up their remains, turning them into mummies. The weight of all the bodies combined didn't even exceed 40 kilograms. According to those that were directly involved in the burials, disposals, and memorials, the liquidators were just wrapped in plastic film. They were then placed in wooden coffins, which were then also wrapped in plastic. Then those wooden coffins were placed inside a zinc container, not lead. The heroes were then laid to rest in the mass graves, commemorated by individual headstones. The victims weren't buried inside these containers for necessity, but rather due to an overabundance of safety and paranoia associated with radiation. The coffins, which were not welded shut, would allow for a small amount of radiation to escape, but such a small amount would not be detrimental to the environment. Number 5. The Chernobyl disaster came at a time during which there was not much understanding of radiation and the effects that it has on living organisms. The fear of what the toxic energy was capable of became a breeding ground for misconception. One of the strangest explanations that residents and onlookers came up with, supposedly based on their own eyewitness testimonies, was that the harmful material led to the creation of mutants, not only in the form of animals, but people too. First, they appeared in books, then in blogs, and soon filled timelines, news feeds, video games, and YouTube channels. Each of these outlets told the stories of bizarre cryptids, legs growing out of their backs, two-headed cannibals, multi-eyed fish, glowing creatures. These mutants were seemingly photographed and spotted on trail cams, only to make their way into the world of social media. Although marketed as evidence of Chernobyl mutants, these fabrications duped the public, who either shook in fear of the beings that lurk in the exclusion zone, or flocked to the area, hoping to see one for themselves. One such mutant creature was the Blackbird of Chernobyl, an alleged mutated man with massive wings and piercing red eyes. Those who encountered this creature would allegedly experience some terrifying nightmares and threatening phone calls. Some believe that the beast may be the same cryptid from Point Pleasant, West Virginia. Although many have claimed to have seen the Blackbird in person, there exists no evidence of the story's validity, and this mutant being wasn't alone either. Chernobyl became a fantastical zoo for the ugly, the transfigured, the supernatural, and the things that no one wanted to see out in the rest of the world. But none of these creatures were ever seen alive, and no scientific evidence backed up the claims that the Chernobyl disaster led to the growth of extra limbs and eyes, or the merging of two species together. It was nothing more than a misconceived myth perpetuated by the media. According to the fallacies were the narratives of irradiated children whose health was doomed from the moment of conception. Peddled by fear, these stories reached far and wide. If you repeat a lie enough times, it becomes a belief. This is precisely what happened in the case of the mutants of the Chernobyl exclusion zone. But the real effects on the animals and people of the area were far more mundane and realistic. One thing that the misconception had right was that mutations took place, but not in the way the narratives suggested. Instead, animals had evolved to deal with high radiation, but not before their populations saw a steep decline. Wolves of the exclusion zone were found to have an altered immune system, which could supposedly come in handy for cancer-fighting patients, according to a group of researchers from Princeton University. Frogs that were in the blast zone were rendered pitch black, and feral dogs adapted to radiation, somewhat altering their genes. Swallows were found to carry gamma radiation-resistant bacteria. Some bacteria were even able to reproduce and thrive when exposed to varying radiation levels. The fantastical zoo turned into an active laboratory, where researchers and scientists worked to debunk the misconceptions about mutations in the exclusion zone, debunking the myths and setting the record straight. Number 4. Following the disastrous event at the nuclear power plant, restoration, containment, and cleanup efforts were underway. It had been months since the Chernobyl disaster, and the sarcophagus was nearing completion by October of that year. It was the second of that month when the Soviet Air Force Mi-8MT of the 112th Independent Helicopter Regiment flew into the area, armed with a decontaminating acetate mixture. The idea was to have the helicopter hover above damaged Reactor 4. They would then allow the decontaminating acetate to flow down into its core. This operation, though, took place at the same time that the sarcophagus was being built. Cranes and other mechanical vehicles stood around Chernobyl as the efforts were underway. Onlookers within the zone spotted the helicopter entering the area and began filming what would become a fatal accident. As the craft hovered above the reactor, it suddenly turned upside down, blades shot off, and shrapnel began to rain down. As the video made its way into the public eye, another misconception was born, both from the supposed eyewitnesses who were there and those who saw it on the news. It became a set belief that the helicopter's controls became confused as a result of the high radiation. The energy, according to them, forced the pilots to lose control, leading to the fatal crash that claimed all lives on board. It also circulated that the Mi-8 plummeted it right into Reactor 4, and the bodies and shrapnel were lost forever. But of course, this was another misconception, an exaggeration of what really happened. The truth behind that unfortunate event had nothing to do with radiation. In the video, a towering crane can be spotted near the reactor where the helicopter is hovering, but due to the lack of signal equipment on the cable, the pilots didn't notice it. They were focused on their task, not thinking of other efforts that were underway that day. The glare of the evening sun made navigation particularly difficult. So as they neared the cables of the crane, the propeller blades hooked onto it and the helicopter spun out of control, upside down, smacking against the crane and littering the ground with its pieces. The pilots and their craft were sent spiraling down, but not straight into Reactor 4, as so commonly believed. Instead, it landed with a cloud of dust right on the construction site. Number 3. In the wake of the harrowing event, people were looking for someone or something to point their finger at, whether it was human error, a faulty design, or an intentional scheme. Among these theories and misunderstandings, many would arrive at an expected narrative that explained how the explosion occurred. After having witnessed the detonation of some explosives prior to this event, it was understandable that some arrived at the conclusion that this was the result of a chain reaction, much like that of the atomic warheads dropped on Nagasaki and Hiroshima. The explosion certainly presented as such. It was loud, fires blazed on, and smoke plumes swirled in the skies as efforts were underway to contain the disaster. For years, this was the accepted explanation, that the Chernobyl disaster was akin to that of an atomic warhead explosion. But that was not the case. Instead, Reactor 4 saw what's known as a steam explosion, and the series of events went something like this. In the early morning hours of April 25th, the reactor was in full power. Steam power was being directed to both generators' turbines. A test was being planned out by the workers, the purpose of which was to determine if one of the turbines could supply enough power to feed water pumps until the standby generator would start in the event of a power failure. By that afternoon, in preparation for the test, before the routine shutdown, the reactor's power was down to 1600 MWT. Only one turbine would be needed to take in the decreased amount of steam, so the other was turned off. In the early morning of April 26th, the test resumed with reactor power reduction, but authorities had demanded to keep the reactor operating at 50% power, though the test only required 22 to 32%. Once permission was received to go ahead, one of the operators would fail to reprogram the computer to maintain that power at 30%, causing it to drop all the way down to 1%. The reactor was filled with solid water, which at this point wasn't boiling. This was the beginning of an unstable situation that only went downhill from here. In an effort to bring the power back up, one of the operators decided to pull a number of the control rods out, leaving less than 26 in the core. The power only increased by 7%. In an effort to prevent the reactor from shutting down, more control rods were pulled, leaving only 6 remaining. By this time, the reactor would not be able to shut down quickly in the event of an emergency. By 1:20 that morning, the 8 cooling water pumps were running at severely low power, leaving the water nearly solid with no void fraction, increasing the vulnerability of a power excursion, which would start a boiling reaction. 4 of the 8 recirculation pumps were also turned off, and reduced coolant caused the voids to form rapidly within the pressure tubes. Reactivity heightened, subsequently producing more steam, and as the system began to feed itself, heat production flourished. Recognizing the emergency, an operator hit the emergency button that would lower the control rods into the core, shutting the reactor down, but this was the last straw. As the graphite-tipped rods were lowered, a small increase of power was ignited, which would have no impact under regular conditions. The conditions at this point, though, were far from regular. Subsequently, the power surge was 100 times the normal rate, climbing to such heights in just 4 seconds. Under heat and pressure, the core began to break down. The fuel assemblies began to break apart, control rods were warped, and steam was building up rapidly. Eventually, the steam tubes burst, releasing tons of it into the reactor, along with heated water. This ultimately caused a disastrous steam explosion, one that was enough to exert enough pressure to blow off the 1,000-ton steel and cement cast biological shield. The roof was now destroyed, and the hot core was exposed to the atmosphere. Fires awoke, and radiation spewed out with the steam, leading to the Chernobyl disaster that destroyed everything in its path, including the nearby town of Pryet. Number 2. There are several misconceptions when it comes to the casualties of Chernobyl. This stems from misinterpretations and false reports on the truth of the disaster. It's long been believed that thousands of residents nearby met an instant demise following the absorption of radiation. Simultaneously, a very modest picture of the true mortality rate has also been painted. For the past 3 decades, reports on the fatalities of the Chernobyl accident suggest that only a few people met their end here and there. Some passed in hospitals years later, and only a couple succumbed to the effects in days. Efforts to downplay the extent of the disaster are obvious, leading to a misconception that leaves the victims of the catastrophe unrecognized. But over the years, more studies have begun to reveal the harrowing truth of the fallout of the Chernobyl disaster, revealing a hidden world of grief and darkness. When Reactor 4 spewed radiation out into the environment and exploded with steam and fire, 2 people immediately lost their lives. This was due to the initial explosion and the workers being within close proximity to the plant. The rest of the workers, of which there were 600, would be exposed to radiation, but wouldn't meet a quick demise. Instead, 134 of them would begin suffering from acute radiation sickness, and 3 months later, 28 of those 134 would pass away. Those who did survive took years to recover. Among the 600, though, through studies and research, it was discovered that they saw a high incidence of leukemia, as well as cataracts, specifically noted among those who received a higher dose of radiation. But the nuclear power plant workers weren't the only ones who came into contact with spiking radiation levels. Maintaining residences nearby in the town of Pryet and other neighboring areas, 115,000 people were evacuated and saw an average dose of 30 microsieverts that day, which would lead to increased health issues among them. The toxic energy also swallowed up neighboring countries, contaminating Belarus, Ukraine, and the Russian Federation. But there exist no tallies for the Chernobyl-related fatalities, allowing the government to downplay the extent of the disaster. Though they had no numbers to compare, a 2016 study revealed that there were almost 2 million people in Ukraine labeled as official victims of the disaster, each of whom got paid compensation. Many of these people tell the stories of spouses, brothers, sisters, mothers, fathers, and children who've all passed away from radiation-related health problems. Those figures do not include Russia or Belarus. These 2 places see an estimate of cancers and fatalities in the hundreds of thousands zone. Number 1. As the flames were being fought by brave firefighters and other efforts were underway, many believed that anyone nearby, including the residents of Pryet, was being immediately evacuated and hauled to safety. It's been erroneously suggested that buses, trucks, and army vehicles arrived one after another. It's quite daunting to discover that this is absolutely not what happened. Within hours of the event, Alexei Makukin, the Soviet Deputy Energy Minister, sent out a secret message to the Soviet Communist Party, relaying the events that had just taken place. He claimed that measures were being made to cool the active zone and that there was no need for evacuation, especially for the nearby town of Pryet. In the interim, those residents began to gather on the railway bridge outside the city in perfect view of the nuclear power plant. They watched as colorful flames, the result of burning graphite, danced higher than the pillars of smoke, playing with the toxic air. But they had no idea that the wind that swept over them carried an almost lethal dose of radiation with it. When things had subsided, the residents went back to their homes and continued with their routine lives. Unbeknownst to them, something detrimental had just taken place. Later that morning, they would awake and go outside. The roads were coated in water and white liquid, and the curbs were foaming. People began to take note of the truckloads of policemen. There'd never been so many in the town before, and it was clear that something was wrong. Still, people were heading to the beach, walking dogs, and playing in the streets. That evening, they would go to sleep again, undeterred by the explosion that occurred that morning. Little did they know that just hours later, they would be leaving their homes forever. It was 36 hours after the disaster that efforts to evacuate the residents first began. At midnight, the first of the buses arrived in Pryet, waiting for the command to begin the procedure. As they waited in a state of emergency, efforts to contain the event were taking place. The fire trucks whined their presence, and the helicopter forebodingly whopped over the town. Radiation levels were slowly dropping, the flames were almost out, and a few of the heroes were being driven off in the back of ambulances or coroner vans. It wouldn't be until 2 p.m. that afternoon, more than a day after the disaster, that residents of Pryet were told to gather their belongings. 43,000 residents clambered into 1,200 buses, an effort that would take 3.5 hours. But most unexpectedly, no one was panicking. They were losing their livelihoods forever, but they didn't realize it just yet. For those who did return, Pryet was found to be devoid of the affection and warmth that it once was brimmed with. Instead, there were armed military personnel, barricades, and warning signs all over. Although the evacuation efforts themselves were not instantaneous, as so misconceived, the loss of their homes and comfort was. The delay and abandonment of the contaminated town didn't come without other consequences either. Many saw health issues in the form of cancers and radiation sickness. They would pass away in hospitals months, years, and even decades later. But even if that Soviet deputy energy minister hadn't sent that secret note proclaiming that evacuation wasn't necessary, the outcome would have likely been the same, because no immediate evacuation is truly immediate. It would have still taken hours to secure each resident. Exposure was inevitable. Thank you guys so much for watching. If you liked this video, be sure to hit that like button. Also, don't forget to subscribe and click that notification bell to keep up to date with all of our future uploads. But my name is Ty Knotts, and I'll catch you guys in the next video.